coming back for this last session where we'll try to tie up some of the loose ends of today. We've got our three speakers on this final session. There was a delay while I gave Derek his script for the afternoon. So our speakers for today are first Derek Hall of the Green Party, Green Left, then Terry, and then Maria. So Derek, if you'd like to start off.
Okay. Sort of shockingly ill prepared. I've been running from the climate justice conference and talking about Latin America and coming here, so bear with me. I mean, the first thing I wanted to say is it's just, to me, so tremendous that we've got Maria here. I'm just so impressed by what the people in the Philippines are doing in terms of having land and practical eco-socialism. And I remember being in this building a year ago when we had Hugo Blanco, who was the great campesino peasant leader, indigenous leader of a peasant revolution in Peru in 1961, still going strong. And his revolution to an extent in 61 was successful. And we remember having this man who's now something like 78, praised by Che Guevara, who led this campesino revolution and was on death row and all these struggles. And we see how those struggles are borne through in Latin America. And what is tremendous is that people are struggling in the same way in Asia, that there are campesinos, there are people equipped with a Marxist and eco-socialist politics who have land. And this to me is the greatest inspiration, because what I'm going to start and finish with is politics. And we can only have the food sovereignty if we have land, and we can only have land if we have political power. So the most important thing is Maria is here, and to congratulate the community she comes from. And I like to always think of the words of Simón Bolívar, who was the great Latin American revolutionary, who said that victory goes to those who persevere, and the people in Mindanao have persevered, and that is the most important thing to me to be here. Now, if we look at the subject of food sovereignty and how we can spread this across the world, I was reading, because I'm writing my book on commons at the moment and the history of commons, and I'm going through, Ellen Ostrom and her associates have got a digital library of commons with something like 10,000 articles, and going through all these open source academic articles. And there was one on the Torres Straits, which is between Papua New Guinea and Australia, which I found particularly interesting in terms of people managing their commons and the indigenous and so on. And they've got a myth, which was great because it sort of combines gods and goddesses with scientific ecological management of resources. And in this, the Torres Straits people talk about the before-time people, and the before-time people, it is said, overfished the turtles and the seabirds, and then were replaced with people who manage the resources more effectively. And the world we're in at the moment, collectively, we're like the before-time people. We're not managing the birds and the turtles and the ecosystems, and we're destroying them. And what we have to do is to build the political alternatives so we can have rational management of food systems, land, society, and everything. And if we look at the way that the food system works, it refracts the pleasant society that we have at the moment that doesn't work. So the first thing that we start off with is our food system is soaked in oil, that it's based on fertilizers and pesticides that are derivatives from oil. It's very, very oil intensive, even independently of climate change. When oil prices rise, food commodity prices rise. And we have to move to an agriculture which is not dependent on oil, in the same way that we have to move to society which is not dependent on oil, because oil is a resource which is becoming more and more expensive, more and more dirty to get hold of. Even the IEA, bourgeois establishment organisation, this week are talking about the fact that oil is moving into the danger zone. It could be, $150 a barrel, and this is even with the whole threat of global recession pushing it down. So the food system is based on oil, and we need to end that. We also have a food system which promotes climate change. So I read, I think it was something I saw here earlier, about one time, you'd get prawns that would go from Britain all the way to Thailand and be shelled and go back. And it's almost if we organise the global food system to produce as many carbon emissions as possible. So this sort of agribusiness, fossil fuel based, this system where we produce food in one part of the world, fly it to another part of the world, that is, messing up the climate system. So that has to go. We can keep going. That, what we learned from Marx, the sort of basic thing we learned from Marx, the first chapter in Das Kapital, is there's a basic distinction between use value and exchange value. And food is a commodity, and commodities are not about use, they're about exchange, they're about making money out of money. So what we have is we have indigenous people, and we have millions, maybe billions of small farmers and campesinos, peasants on this planet. But the whole global agricultural food system is not organised to feed people. And in fact, when you hear people going on about this and saying we need to expand food stocks and so on, it's a lie. The world food system is not organised to functionally feed us all. It's constructed to make profit. Yeah? So, when people talk about population and consuming too much food and so on, it's the same with pharmaceutical companies. They're not doing it, to heal the sick. They're doing it to make money. So all of the power structures are wrong. If we look at land ownership, I'm not from a Trotskyist tradition, that's not my tradition, but I believe he talked about uneven and combined development. So you look at places like the Philippines, and you've got relics of haciendas and Spanish occupation, and you've got kind of postmodern capitalism that organises food chains on a global scale. But what it comes down to is if you look at control of land, that is dominated by elites. Very, very fine description of this we get from Marx in chapter 27 of Das Kapital, where he talks about enclosure in Britain, and you had a feudal system, and you had commons, the wasteland that was used by the serfs so they could reproduce themselves and work. And then how there were battles, and people became class consciousness, and people got more land and had more commons, and how you had to destroy the commons to create the proletariat. And this still continues around the globe. So if we're talking about food sovereignty, a basic issue is control of land. We still have in Britain and the Philippines like a feudal system. I mean, people say I'm very unfair to Prince Charles and you shouldn't bear grudges about the Vikings who took the land in 1066. If they give us back the land, I'm not going to give any grudges. I'm not prejudiced against Scandinavians. But, we still have these relics of this feudal system in Britain. Land ownership is very, very undemocratic, and it stems to that. And again, in the Philippines, you've got this. And what we also know from today is you have land grabs, that with the system being more and more ecologically destructive, though the corporations deny this, they act as because they know it's true and they want to grab more land, and there's big battles for kind of food security, and that's taking food away from local people. So we have to change the ownership. We can also look at the way that food, like everything else, is increasingly dominated by finance capital, where you're making money out of money. You have hedging and derivatives and so on. And any element of a capitalist economy, there's a myth of functionality. So they'll go, hey, in the past we used to barter, that was inconvenient, and we invented money. In fact, that's just a complete lie. You can look at the David Graeber book on this, for example. And there are various kind of myths of economics. You have the notion of marketisation being efficient, and buying and selling, and natural, and so on. And of course that was built on the theft of the land. But what we have a system now is it's increasingly about derivatives, and what we've seen is the sort of dictatorship of bond markets and derivative markets in European democracies. So a government's been unseated in Greece. I'm very pleased to see Berlusconi go, but I wanted the workers to remove him and not the capitalists. And what you have is that democracy can be suspended if there's a danger that the democracy will vote against austerity because we need austerity to please the bond markets. So the same way in feudalism there was an aristocratic class, now there's maybe a derivatives market, bond market, capitalist class. You know, we see this with foods. Food is a speculative item, the land is speculated, and you know, we see resistance. Martin, myself, other people have been down to Occupy. I'm hoping some of you maybe go down to Occupy after this and listen to David Harvey deconstructing capitalism. And it's certainly wrong to say that people at Occupy are not interested in challenging capitalism. You know, the fact they've got Harvey there. And Martin and myself did a presentation on eco-socialism, got some very positive reactions. And there was a guy there who was a bond trader who joined, worked in one of the markets, who joined the protest. And somebody said to me later that he was saying to people at Occupy, if you look at derivatives markets, it's like somebody holding up a £50 note in a hall of mirrors, and every reflection of the mirror, somebody thinks that they have the £50, yeah? And to kind of keep that system going, to stop it being defaulting, you know, governments in Britain, Italy, Greece, Portugal, right across, are quite prepared to shut down old people's homes, make us work longer, so on and so forth. And food too is part of this kind of speculative process. So what we need is an agriculture that works for people and for the planet. So that's got to be something which is closer to organic, a lot more food has got to be produced locally, but these decisions are decisions that have to be made by people, and at the moment, you know, they're decided by supermarkets, agribusiness companies like Cargill's, derivative markets, feudal remnants, so on and so forth, but we've got to put people in control. There are some good models for this. One, of course, that I think people know about is Cuba. So, of course, there was the end of the oil from the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union collapsed. And what happened was you had solidarity activists from Australia coming over to Cuba, and people were very short of food, particularly in the cities. And the capitalists were waiting for Cuba to fall apart because the capitalists hate the threat of a good example. But at the moment with capitalism failing, you know, any example is a threat to them. And what happened was they built a permaculture plot on the top of Roberto Perez's dad's house. I know Roberto Perez, something you may have met. And that works as sort of permaculture organic, very diverse. That was rolled out. There's still problems in Cuba with food because a lot of people like to eat bread. You can't grow wheat. With climate change, it's more difficult to grow garlic. You've still got this kind of misreading of a socialist economy of kind of central planning, and that hasn't helped agricultural productivity. But what you have is in the cities, because it's a social movement, because the society it is, people can use land, the land isn't monopolised, and there's this huge growing of permaculture organic. And I've talked to people who've said if it wasn't for that, people would have starved in the worst period of the special period. So that, I think, gives us an alternative. That's an alternative that we can kind of roll out. Politics of food and commons, absolutely crucial. I saw a quote from Hal Draper. I'm not a great Hal Draper fan, to be honest, really, but about Engels talking about Marx. And Engels saying Marx was politicised over land issues because in the 1830s and 40s, something like 70% of the court cases were for theft in the Rhineland, and this was peasants going to the forest that traditionally they'd had access to and picking up firewood. So the classic bit of revolutionary journalism that Marx came up with was on the law against theft in the forests, and that's a land issue. In Britain, people used to gather lots of food. The commons in Britain wasn't destroyed because people overgrazed it, but it was destroyed because people could use the commons and then they could go to the pub and play their games and have leisure, and that was something which was offensive to the rulers. Just had a very interesting experience. I dislike his sort of anti-sex views, and I'm not really any kind of Christian or anarchist, but I've just read Tolstoy's amazing revolutionary novel Resurrection, which is, you know, the novel, you know, from from Tolstoy, which is forgotten because it's his most political novel, and it's basically how he became a revolutionary, and he condemns virtually every aspect of Tsarist Russia, but talks specifically about how people are criminalised by the land being stolen. So what the food sovereignty comes back to, yes, we have to have a critique of agribusiness, we have to, as socialists, be green, and occasionally socialists have forgotten to be green, unlike Marx and Engels. But essentially, it's about power, politics, it's about the struggle against enclosure. To me, you know, the idea of communism, economic democracy, it's about collective democratic control of society. And the key thing is how can we actually build that? And that is the reason I'm most excited that we've got this talk from Maria. And that's why I'm most excited to be a comrade of Hugo Blanco, who is our comrade who led a successful revolution and speaks for eco-socialism. And I'm even more excited that I've been equipped by this wonderful speech that Sean has given me from Joel Colville. And Joel Colville, who wrote The Enemy of Nature, one of the great thinkers of eco-socialism we quite often have here, you know, has been down to Occupy. And what's interesting is in 951 cities across the world, there is Occupy. And, you know, people can carp and say, this isn't socialism, this isn't ecological. I've seen indigenous people rightly criticise it because it's more about banking than the fact of the theft of the land from the indigenous. But nonetheless, people are actually saying, we want an economy that works for people, not just for a tiny minority of people. We don't want an economic system which is destroying everything. We're not going to put up with our society being closed down to fund the bond markets. And that struggle is an impressive and important struggle, because capitalism, you know, is no longer in any sense progressive. Capitalism can no longer build, capitalism can only destroy. That if you look at the basic architecture that we have, that doesn't work. If you have the wrong kind of architecture, you have ugly buildings and they fall down. And property rights, systems, structures, the way that capitalism works is entirely unsustainable. It can only grow by destroying the basic life support systems on this planet. And the question is not exactly what we replace it with, the question is not who we agree with, who we don't disagree with, but the question is how we build political power to change that. So, you know, we've got to be constantly politically engaged, we've constantly got to be thinking strategically, but the fact that we have this Occupy movement is something which is encouraging. So Joel, lovely stuff from Joel. So this is a speech, I think this was just 2 days ago. I'm honoured to be here this evening because you're the light of the world. I'm not saying this to flatter, but because we have to understand it deeply. Your genius has been seized upon, your genius has been to seize upon the emerging hopes of humanity and give them a form of realisation. Now you're on the threshold of a world-transforming process and you must decide whether to cross over it. And what I would say to you is that to get food that we can eat, to have a future for our kids, we need to make eco-socialist revolution. The great eco-socialist leader, William Morris, you know, in Britain, formed the first Marxist organisation, the SDF. He always talked about educate, agitate, organise. If you want a